This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. This episode is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, a community of more than 45,000 beer and brewing enthusiasts worldwide. The AHA publishes Zymergy Magazine, hosts the National Homebrew Competition and HomebrewCon, and equips members with brewing tips, proven recipes, and money-saving deals on beer, food, and brewing supplies. Founded in 1978, the AHA remains true to founder Charlie Papazian's timeless advice: relax, don't worry, have a homebrew. Celebrate beer and homebrewing with the AHA at homebrewersassociation.org. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on the podcast today is Firestone Walker Barrel Works director and brand manager, Jeffers Richardson. Welcome to the podcast, Jeffers.
Hey, good to be here.
Love to have you here in Fort Collins, and we are here at the world headquarters of
I know,
Craft
it
Beer
feels
and Brewing.
very worldly here.
This is where all of our magic happens. I've been to where your magic happens a number of times now.
Yes, you have.
At least 5 or 6 times.
So yeah, I'm just going to jump in here. I saw you in June at Invitational.
The Firestone Walker Invitational Beer
Right.
Festival.
What'd you think?
You know, that's my 3rd year attending the Firestone
Lucky
Walker
you.
Invitational Beer Festival. You know, after the first year, my partner John and I, who both went, looked at each other and said that festival has a spot on our calendar every year from here until they stop putting the festival on. You know, we go to a lot of festivals and we see a lot of beer, and you know, and we have there are endless relationships and friends in the beer industry, and you know, we try to give everybody a fair shake and spend time with all of our friends. The Firestone Walker Invitational is singular in its approach to hospitality for brewers, for media, and in its approach of towards quality. That idea of building this experience that integrates local food purveyors, that integrates fantastic brewers, world-class brewers, innovative brewers, brings them in from around the world and pulls them together. I mean, there's a reason the brewers come to that festival year after year whenever they have the invitation. And there's a reason that a number of my brewer friends directly lobby everyone that they know at Firestone Walker for an invitation to that festival.
I get a lot of lobbies, and luckily I get to say, not my decision.
Whose decision is it out there? I mean, because I know a lot of brewers want to know
ultimately, it's Matt Brendelson, our brewmaster.
Yeah.
It's his event. He created this.
So Matt's going to get that flood of boxes of beer.
Exactly. So when people call me and say, how do I get in? And it's like, well, get to know Matt.
Yeah,
and it really is about personal relationships, because the very first year that came out, he literally went through his Rolodex.
Right.
Anybody, for those of people who know what a Rolodex is, he went through
You're showing your age, Jeffers.
Yes, I am. It's his mailing list, and called up people he knew and who he thought he'd be comfortable inviting, people he had a relationship with, right. And so that kind of philosophy and that culture is continued. And then the people who show up, the people who come to the festival, same thing. We just don't have issues. It's just one of these things where you walk away. I've been doing this since 2012. As I was telling you earlier, I've always thought that, okay, this is the year that I'm going to say last year was better. And I never get there. It really is one of those things where you kind of walk away just high as a kite from it. It's like going to Woodstock over and over again. It's
and
it's
it
fun.
really is, even from the brewer's perspective. And I don't want to harp on this too long.
No.
But from the Friday night party, in the brewers camp to Saturday night hangout sessions, the festival is just the actual tasting session, for consumer and ticket buyers is only one part of the overall weekend from a brewer's perspective. And for us, being able to hang out with those people that we know and love and respect, and do it in this kind of informal way at this one time of the year that's always, it becomes that thing. And, it was so fun this year to see, Kim Jordan and Dick Cantwell.
Yeah. In their Sprint.
In their Sprinter van camping, at the Firestone Walker Invitation. That is how bizarre
Not just
it is,
camping, but in a rodeo arena.
Yes.
That was great.
Right. And if you haven't seen the hospitality that the Rare Barrel guys pull out and others on that Friday night, I mean, I know a few people that go to the festival have a fantastic time, but even the brewers geek out on the party that happens behind the scenes. So,
Yep.
And then the other thing that I guess nobody really knows out there is that once the party is over, once the festival is over, all the leftover beer that the folks don't drink ends up at a party for the brewers later that night.
No, it doesn't end.
You haven't lived until you've had self-serve barrel-aged stouts of the rarest kind from the hottest breweries in the country, just sitting out there on a draft trailer for all the brewers to drink from. So
damn, I missed out on that. No,
man,
actually, I did. It's
you were just drinking the Trumer pills, and so that was that.
At some point, I think I was just drinking water. But
fair enough. Fair enough.
Yeah,
I probably should have drunk a little bit more of that.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about Firestone Walker and Barrel Works. That is your thing. Now, it hasn't always been your thing. You've had a long and storied career, and I don't know if a lot of people know this, but you were actually head brewer before Brynildson for this whole thing.
Yeah. So I was let's see where to start here. So yeah, I was working for a Bay Area craft brewery chain at the time called the Tide House. I had 3 operations, and I was overseeing all of that. I got a call one day, and one time I was describing somebody like I was on a cell phone, but this was pre-cell phone. So I got a landline call from an English bloke named David Walker, and he told me his project, that they were part of a winery, that they wanted to do something with barrels, and I don't know, I was just sort of intrigued by it. And after about a month of courtship, jumped on board, and we built a brew house out of literally duct tape and baling wire. I mean, it was that seriously. It was that crude, and I mean, I remember the first time I saw the equipment that they had purchased without talking to me. I think they picked it up at a flea market in L.A. And but anyway, we made it work.
If only they sold brewing equipment at flea markets back then.
I really, honestly, I think they probably did at this case. Yeah. You should. There's no way to describe this because it was equipment that was not designed to make beer, and yet we made beer off of it, and we did a decent job of it. And for 5 years we did that until, in fact, we built. We were going to expand into a brewery. This kind of leads up to the Barrel Works. Is down the road we built a building to move into, to expand into. At that point, I think we were probably making about 4,000 barrels a year, which wasn't that much for us. Although it was, we made 800 barrels our first year. But anyway, we were going to move into it, and there were some issues. Turns out we couldn't use the wastewater system, so that pretty much kills your operation there. So we stuck in our existing situation on a vineyard. Surrounded by a couple of oil derricks with a beautiful view of a 6,000-foot mountain. It was very bucolic atmosphere. But we ended up purchasing a brew house up in Paso, and we moved everything up there. And that's kind of all she wrote. That's where Matt came on board. At this point, I followed I tend to be a very passionate person. I followed a girl to Chico. And I ended up brewing for Sierra Nevada. But meanwhile, exit Jeffers, enter Matt. And, that's been an incredible story. So that was the main production. And
at least 40 GABF medals since then.
Something like
that.
But then in 2012, we decided to go back to that facility which we had built. That was supposed to be our new brew house, and opened up the Barrel Works. And basically, I came back on board. I had literally taken some time off of brewing and got into olive oil, but that's a whole nother story. And teamed up with a guy named Jim Crooks, and we built the Barrel Works.
So 2012, what was the impetus for Firestone Walker to jump into the sour beer arena at that point?
So we were toying with it. Basically, Jim was messing around.
Toying with it, like, there's toying
Not
with
official.
it, and then there's we have 20,000 square feet.
No,
in
so
this,
toying with
in
it
this
literally
wine warehouse, and we're gonna hire multiple people. And
well, toying with it is it's contraband. Is that Jim is in a back room somewhere away from production, messing with wild yeast, somewhat close to our production facility. But not
and
in
Matt
it.
was like, "Get that stuff."
No, Matt was
here.
on board that. The people who didn't know were was Adam Firestone and David Walker, the namesakes.
Oh, okay.
It literally came down to a point. It was a game of cat and mouse, keeping that stuff far away. Eventually, it was caught, and at one point, Adam Firestone literally had that stuff out on the curb, ready to pour it down the drain. He came from the wine background, so the idea of having Brett and lactobacillus anywhere near a facility was was just it was Armageddon to him.
Right.
So he was, literally ready to pour it down the drain. And David came in and talked him off the ledge. David had just been on a trip with Matt to Belgium, had visited Cantillon, Beaune, etc. And David could see something. He saw what? There's something here. And he talked him off the ledge, but at that point, the decision was, okay, get it the hell away from the production facility. And so this was probably, I don't know, maybe 2010, 2011. And so the discussion was, what are we going to do? This is something we should pursue, not pour down the drain, but where are we going to do this? And it was just obvious at that point. It's like, hey, we have this facility that we've never really used. It's now a bonded wine warehouse. It was supposed to be a brewery. And, it goes back to our origins. This is where we brewed for the first 5 years of our existence. Let's move this down there. It's 86 miles away from the brewery, downwind, and we can run amok down there. And let the inmates run the asylum, and so that's what happened. So basically, we had this facility in 2012 full of a bunch of boxes of wine, and it took a while to get them out of there, but we finally told them, literally it came down to an announcement on email to the winemakers. On this date, Brettanomyces will enter the building. And by that weekend, seriously, they were gone. It was because this was our third attempt. 2 attempts, they just were, they didn't take it seriously. And then when they realized the plague was arriving, they got out pretty quickly.
Fair enough. So what was the creative direction then? Were you just given carte blanche to make some beer, or is there a point of view behind Firestone Walker's approach to making acidic beer?
All the above. The Firestone Walker culture and the approach is always to do something. We've always been about blending. We've always been about balance. And we've always been about barrels. When I was there in '96, our very first beers were fermented in barrels. So that has always carried along with Firestone Walker. But yeah, in a way, David Walker put this very, I thought, eloquently and in a funny way. He said, we put Jim and Jeffers in a petri dish, and we looked to see what would grow, and that's exactly what they did. They basically threw us together, and Jim had been messing around with this stuff. So initially, we were working with some beers that he had been working on, and we grew them up a little bit. But what eventually took place was we started to collaborate, kind of like songwriters, if you will, on different beers, just brainstorming different ideas, and then coming up with some beers of that, and tasting it, and then deciding whether that was something we wanted to blend together and make a beer. And that's kind of how we've gone forward. Is Jim runs the barrel room, and Jim is our mad scientist. And he doesn't like the word mad, but he's got that creative edge, and so do I. So one of our beers came up on my 1 hour commute to work. I was stuck in traffic, and I just started thinking about some things that I wanted to work on, and I said, hey, I've got this idea. And then we would start riffing on it. Or he would come and say, hey, you know what? The guy from the pumpkin patch called me up the day after Halloween and says, I got all these pumpkins. I hear maybe you could use them. And and I'm saying, well, Matt doesn't want to do pumpkin beers. And he's like, I want to do a pumpkin beer. Okay, no pumpkin spices. And so we just started riffing. And eventually we would come up with an idea, and the beer, Matt would say, what do you mean you're doing a pumpkin beer? And he would taste it and go, okay, proceed. and so it was just this really kind of, it is a padded room in many ways. We communicate a lot, and we talk about different ideas, and one idea leads to another and another and another, and we eventually make a beer, and then we taste it, and then at the end of the day, we're blenders at heart. And so we will make sure that the beer is where we want it to be. Maybe it's a beer we like, but it doesn't have enough oak character, so we'll bring in something that has a lot of oak character, or something that we want more acidity or less acidity. So that's kind of how it works. It really is kind of it's a very creative environment.
Now, you all have embarked on some interesting and some crazy experiments, and you are still kind of, if we look at it, there is not necessarily, a core continuity in the entire program. You are still in a pretty broad space right now, and I say that not in a critical way, but in a, if you look at some other sour beer makers, especially those in Belgium and whatnot, they have honed in on exactly what works for them. And what they produce, is produced, but it's produced across a rather narrow range. You all are still doing everything from fruited Berliner Weiss experiments, based experiments, to Reginald Brett, this 10%, big, barrel aged and then soured,
it's
kind
our Manhattan cocktail.
Your Manhattan cocktail, and so the range of what you're doing right now in sour beer is still rather broad.
Yeah.
How do you find a thread of continuity through that?
Well, I think, no matter how broad it is, by a Belgian tradition or even a European tradition, which are more steeped in those traditions, whether it's German lager or a Gueuze, and we don't pretend to ever mimic that. We're inspired by it, and we might make something slightly different. And I think that is part of the North American experience in craft, is that, when I started in craft, we were all trying to mimic English bitters and pale ales, but we didn't. We created our own style. We created the American pale ale. Think what Sierra Nevada created. That is the most iconic pale ale that I can think of. We created a version of that. Many breweries created a version. So eventually, we have room to kind of experiment, because that's the American way, I think. We do things boldly. We push the envelope on the borders of what's acceptable, and then we eventually kind of come back to what that is, and we solidify that. And I think we do that a bit with Barrelworks. Is we're always experimenting, but we have a general idea. As we do look to Belgium, to what we think of as, this is a classic Gueuze. This is a beer that we're going to blend 4-year-old with 2-year-old beer. We're not going to call it a Gueuze, because out of respect for the Gueuze producers, but this is our style, our representation in that particular style of beer. We just won't call it that. And then we might take from that. We might go, now what if we were to add alala berries to this? So it's constantly that, and it's funny. This whole idea is my wife is Arabic, and we eat a lot of Arabic food, and I'm from California, and she'll sit there and produce a hummus, and I'll sit there like, what if we were to add this spice? And she'll say, yeah, that's great, but don't call it hummus. And so it's similarly, sure, we have these these standards, these centuries old, or at least decades old standards in Belgium, and in North America we don't have those traditions. We have a license to kind of experiment. We riff on these things, and so it's okay for them to say, yeah, that's great, but it's not a Pilsner because you dry hopped it. But you know what? The end result is still pretty fantastic. So we're just going to keep doing what we do. We don't have a Reinheitsgebot. And so we have this, I think we have this great license to to move and go places. And sometimes we go to some pretty ridiculous places, but eventually it comes back. We'll bring it back into something that's acceptable to something we want to do and what people are willing to drink.
I think that's an interesting sentiment, and I enjoy that. My global perspective on the American influence on beer was impacted significantly last week. I flew over to Geneva, Switzerland, and spent a week in the Jura region of France.
Sounds terrible.
It's awful. It's awful. Guest of the Comte Cheesemakers Association. God. One of the interesting pieces that came out of that, we were in Lison outside of Saint Claude, and and went to a small brewery, Brasserie de Lison, and the brewer Emile was incredibly excited to pour for me his APA, and he made sure that he called it an APA because this is his American Pale Ale.
Huh.
And it was the coolest but weirdest and also awesome thing to be there in France, in this an area that's not known for beer at all, and to taste this beer that he had made because it tastes like an American Pale Ale.
And now I'm going to ask you, so what kind of hops was he using usually it's the hops that sort of the signature for the American Pale Ale.
He was a big fan of Amarillo hops.
Okay, so he was using new hops.
Oh, he was using Pacific
He wasn't
Northwest
using
hops.
the 3 C's.
No, he was taking a
the
very
Chinook,
progressive
Cascade,
approach on that. Sure.
and which are
right.
I think of it
There
the
was
American
no
noble
Cascade in
hops.
there. I think he did use Centennial and Amarillo in that one.
God, that it's such a it's an overlooked style right now because everyone's looking to IPAs and the various versions of that. And I mean, the Pale Ale to me is such a beautiful style, and I do hope that people will revisit that at some point.
But there's an interesting piece that we are now, American brewers started looking at Europe for inspiration, and Europe is now also looking at the United States for inspiration.
Isn't it amazing? The tail is wagging the dog.
Well, and I love that there is this, cross inspiration. It's not coming one direction, in any particular way. It is definitely flowing both ways, and we are both.
I would agree.
Yeah.
Like when I started, we looked to England, or in that case, maybe you looked to Germany. Belgium came on a little later. You looked for inspiration, but what we ended up creating was something very uniquely American. And now a lot of European younger brewers and newer brewers are looking to that, and I think they're going to create something uniquely to their area. And we will turn around and probably look to that for inspiration. So yeah, you're right. It kind of goes back. We're feeding each other. It's. I think that is sort of it's the gestalt of the whole craft brewing industry. It's beautiful.
The thing I was most impressed about is that he wasn't dialing in his recipe to taste like an oxidated old American IPA, and that is one of the biggest problems.
Yes.
That other brewer friends have related to me that. When you have European brewers, they are only tasting American hoppy beers after they've sat on a boat for 4 months.
That have taken a long voyage.
Right.
Yep.
And so in fact, what they end up mimicking is that like old oxidated flavor of that. And thankfully, this was.
It'd be like us recreating a Heineken after it's been on the boat. And we used to joke about that. If you want to make a continental lager, make a light lager and put it in your trunk for 2 weeks, and then put it in green bottles and then serve it.
It's funny, but I mean, that is actually true. I mean, if you look at the kind of American brewers' approach to Belgian style beers, a lot of what Americans make, in homage, to those Belgian styles is based on those specific Belgian styles that can actually live through, transit over the ocean. And there are plenty of Belgian styles that are brewed by Belgian brewers that they don't import to the United States because they can't make it over here in that kind of fresh and bright way.
And yet there's some beers like, Barrelworks beers, which are aged for a very long time before they ever go into a bottle, and they can age for many years after that. And so part of that, as long as they're not left in your trunk of your car, and they keep warm. I mean, if they're kept at 55 degrees, say, I mean, they will age beautifully. They will evolve, but they will evolve like a really fine Burgundian wine or Bordeaux. I mean, I mean, that's the beauty. But yes, some of these fresh beers, obviously, it's best to have them probably within a month or two.
That was a spectacular way to bring it back to Barrel Works, and thank you for that, Jeffers. Speaking of Barrel Works, so I just popped open this bottle of Reginald Brett. It is a rich wine-like experience. It is, brown but not a nude brune. It is a 10% beer, and so there is a very high alcohol content to it, and yet there's a very well-placed acidity that's not overwhelming, but that fits within that balance of sweetness. Tell me a little bit about this beer.
So this is, I think this is sort of the quintessential Firestone experience. Basically, the base beer for this is a double DBA. Double DBA is
that's a beer you guys don't make anymore, is it?
No, I know.
Much to my own chagrin, I still
tell me about it.
I have one bottle of that 2014
It ages
double DBA
beautifully.
left in
It's
my
actually
cellar.
one of those beers that actually is something it should age. But this is a double DBA. DBA Double Barrel Ale was the very first beer we ever made. So again, we talk about tradition. I mean, and we are steeped in that. Is we love to create this lineage of beers. So DBA actually has created many different beers. We've created Agrestic with that, which is also from a DBA-based beer. Double DBA.
We'll get to Agrestic later. We have another bottle
We have
here.
about four different beers that are based on the original beer that we made when we opened our doors 23 years ago, I think. But this one is unusual because what we did is, in addition to taking a foundational beer, is that we put it through several of our barrel programs. We have 3 barrel programs. DBA usually is fermented on American oak. We didn't do that here. We used to do that. But what we did is we took this beer, a double strength DBA, fermented it in stainless steel, and then we sent it over to our spirit barrel program, which is a separate building, separate facility, separate story, and it aged in bourbon barrels for about 6 to 8 months. So it picked up all that bourbon character. Then we shipped that beer, we transferred it, and we shipped it to Barrel Works. And then we put it in our barrel program where it was introduced to Brettanomyces and Lactobacillus. And so now it's picked up that it's got a tartness to it. It has that funky characteristic. And this is probably one of the most complex beers that we make. It's got body because it's got that alcohol. It has that bourbon, kind of a wisp of bourbon to it. It has this citrusy character. That's why I was saying it's like a Manhattan cocktail. There's a slight bourbon, malty, tart, body. I mean, it's just one of the most unique beers that we make. And we jokingly called it Reginald Brett, and then we Googled it, and it turns out there really was a Reginald Brett. He was a lord or a viscount or something in England, and it turns out he was a radical in England. So we thought, okay, we can live with that as a name. But yeah, this is the highest alcohol beer that we make at Barrel Works. It took a while for us to figure out how to bottle it.
How did you bottle it? And this is the thing. I mean, when you're talking about high alcohol environments and re-fermenting in the bottle to bottle condition, like that's a serious challenge, especially with the level of acidity that's now in this beer.
It's more a level is because we bottle condition these, meaning we introduce yeast again and some sugar to bottle condition these and create CO2. So what we have to do, of course, and then they're not filtered, so all the other wild yeast is in there. And Brettanomyces is quite the scavenger. It will consume just about any carbohydrate it comes in contact with. So what we have to try to do is make sure that when we do bottle it, that we've consumed all those fermentable sugars, so we don't get overcarbonation in the bottle. This was a particularly challenging beer because it does have some body. It had some non-fermentable, so we just had to make sure that it spent enough time in barrels and all that where we could make sure that it was basically when we bottle these is they're basically dry. There is not a high level of fermentable sugar there, so that the Brett could start consuming that and overcarbonate it or worse, blow up a bottle. But it took us a while to figure this one out. Our other beers are usually around 5 or 6, maybe 7%. We kind of have those dialed in where we bring them in. Basically, they get bottle conditioned when they're about 1 Plato or below, because at that point there's really just not a lot of fermentable sugar left. other than what we introduce for bottle conditioning.
This one doesn't taste like a one Plato beer.
I know it's tricky, isn't it? It's got some fullness on the palate. That could be the measure of alcohol. And again, these are non-filtered. So if there was fermentable sugar there, over time, that would we did this last year, so we would be noticing it by now. So we just have to let them. We have to be patient and let them ferment in the barrel.
Do you condition your bottling yeast to avoid that kind of like terminal shock, acid shock?
No, I mean, I'd have to ask Jim about this. I'm not. We use a champagne yeast,
Okay.
DV10. Pretty standard. I mean, basically, we kind of follow the model that Russian River follows. I
Yeah.
mean, we're good friends with those guys.
Sure.
So, I mean, like a lot of breweries, we consult with people we respect and trust and are friends with. New Belgium,
Of course.
Russian River, and we did some trials and we settled in on this yeast that is more or less alcohol tolerant. It's very clean. It produces a nice fermentation, but with one caveat, I have noticed we keg beer too, but we force carbonate that. We do not add this champagne yeast for that. It's just we force carbonate in the tank and then we keg. It's interesting to see these over time because when we bottle condition, we kind of rouse everything else that's in there. And while there's not a lot of food source there, we tend to pick up, I think, more rustic character in those in the bottled beers. Not to say anything's wrong with a keg beer. In fact, what's really beautiful about that is the keg beers tend to be a little bit more consistent over time because they're kept usually cool about 40 degrees. Right. And whereas the bottle, we don't know how the bottles are held. The bottle we're drinking here came out of my personal stash. I store at 55 to 60 degrees. Yeah. So I mean, it's a temperature where you're not going to get a lot of activity, but there's a very low level of activity among the yeast. So there is some activity, but it's very minimal. And I mean, look at the head retention on that. And this is what I love about this is usually with the wild beers, you're consuming all the protein. There's not a lot of hops in these, so you tend to get these flat beers that look like cider. And trying to maintain a little bit of head retention. We kind of looked at how the Belgians were doing it. It's like, how are they doing it? Well, they add all those old hops. And they may not add bitterness, but they add material for hops to cling to and add some head retention to that. So,
So
cheers.
you use some aged hops in this?
We have our own techniques here. I mean, I will keep that a secret. But,
wow, so cagey and Belgian in your secrecy.
I know. We got to do that occasionally, right? There's hot material in here, yes.
Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit. One of the things that you are maybe well known for within the beer world is your Jeffers drops acid presentation. This is it's a presentation on how to sense and how to build a palate for tasting sour beer. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that it changed the way that I taste sour beer.
Wow, that's good to hear.
I'm a beer professional, and I've worked in this field for 6 years now. But experiencing your Jeffers drops acid presentation, I think it was in the basement of Falling Rock a couple of years ago in Denver.
3 years ago.
3 years ago.
I was just thinking. I thought it was 2 years ago. It was 3 years ago.
Yeah. Thank you for that invitation. But you have a very specific method of walking through the various acid components, lactic acid, acetic acid, at varying concentrations to help people develop and articulate an idea of what those acids taste like so that they can ultimately then pick those out of finished beer and be able to figure out what those things are. The thing that changed it for me was that idea of acetic acid being a physical experience and being a place in the back of your throat where you taste it. And going through that with you and being able to know that when I feel that acid in the back of my throat, that's acetic acid. It's not a taste thing. It's not happening on my tongue.
It's a sensation.
It's it's a specific feel and a specific burn right there, and it's in a place in my throat. Like that was a very pivotal thing for me and helped me approach sour beer in a different kind of way. Tell me a little bit about how you formulated this idea and how you built this education program, which, to be honest, every brewery in America should be running for their own staff in order to help educate them about how sour beer can be tasted.
Wow, that's a big question.
Sorry if that's too weighty for you.
No, it's not weighty. It's just there's a lot of questions in there. I would say
that important.
I would say it starts with us asking ourselves that question. Jim and I, asking questions about the making of our own beer is, how we decided at some point, and if you get a bottle of our beer, we put the titratable acidity, the acid level, the lactic acid level, on our bottles. We just thought that was good information. But of course, then if we put that on there, we realized maybe there's an educational component to that. So these things are in our heads, for our own purposes. How do we, as blenders, at the end of the day, when we're sitting there barrel sampling, how do we talk to each other? We need a common language, and that's descriptive analysis. It's descriptive analysis, whether we're talking about the fruit component, the acid component, whatever. But the acid component needed something that we could measure. And so titratable acidity was a great way to correlate how we taste. I mean, you can give it a numerical equation from 0 to whatever. And so that's how when we're blending, we talk about it. We can immediately taste beer and say we think that's between a 6 and a 7. And usually we're right, somewhere in between. We're not exact. But usually what we're doing is when we blend a beer, we have an idea of where we want to go with it. And so that helps us get there. It's not enough. It's too much. Let's blend in something that has less acid. Let's blend in something that has more. But the idea is to create a level of acid that is present, knowable, that doesn't overwhelm. So with that in mind, I was asked one time to fill in for Matt Brindleson. We had a busload of 60 social media and podcast folks from LA. They wanted to come up, and so I said, "Fine, you get your way up here. We'll entertain you." And part of that was Matt was going to talk about hops, and he couldn't make it, and he said, "Jeffers, can you fill in for me?" And I said, "Okay, yeah, sure." And then I started to brood over it, and I thought, it's kind of like I feel like a physician who hasn't practiced in a while. Hops are not my game. Acid is my game, and I'm not really. I don't feel like I can talk about hops, but I'd be like from 10,000 years ago. So I said, "Hey, what would you think about me doing something on acid? It's kind of closer to what we're doing." They said, and it was Gemma. Gemma's like, "Yeah, that sounds."
This is Gemma Wilson, your social media.
Yeah, she was putting this on. She was in charge of this. She goes, "Yeah, that sounds great." And so I put together a class, and I talked to Jim Crooks, our barrel guy, our barrel guru, my partner on this, and we designed a class. And it was like I had the basic idea for it, and then again, it was just like making a beer. He came in and said, "Hey, we could do this, this, and this." I was like, "Fantastic!" So I went back and said, "Hey, I'm going to do this thing on acid, and it's going to be a little different, but it'll help people understand our beers." And Gemma said, "Well, what do you want to call it?" And I just riffed. I said, "How about Jeffers Drops Acid Knowledge?" And she said, "Oh, that's fantastic. What does David Walker think?" David Walker being our owner of our brewery. And I said, "Don't tell him." I said, "It's if he finds out about it, he'll be fine. If we ask him ahead of time, he'll find reasons that maybe we shouldn't do it." So we just did it, and it was a little crude at that point, but basically the whole idea was to let people understand acid, mainly as you pointed out. Lactic and acetic acid, which are the main acids you will find in sour beers. There are other ones, but these are the two main components. And we have a preference for lactic acid. We think a little bit of acetic acid is a good thing, but too much is not. And as you pointed out, acetic acid is a volatile acid. You can feel it. You can smell it. You can feel it on the back of your palate. You can feel it in your stomach. It tends to fill you up. It's something that we think is a little bit goes a long way, whereas lactic acid is much cleaner. And so we tend to have a preference there. So we built this class to educate people on what acid is, the different types of acid, and then to taste through beers and give people an opportunity to estimate that acidity level. And believe it or not, what I love about this is people coming in completely cold turkey, giving them samples of water that have acid levels as references, and then bringing the beer it's how close people get to what the actual acid level is. So people pick it up pretty quickly.
So if people want to, if other brewers want to try this at home and, kind of balance and test, their own sensitivity to these kinds of acids, can they do this, and how do they do this? Walk me through some of the basics.
It's a little harder because you need a reference point, right? I mean,
Sure.
We all need a reference point, what a 0 is and what a 10 is. So that's what we do in this class. Is I create the goalposts for this, and then we bring beers so people have a reference point. So I'm not sure how at home you could do a reference point, other than if somebody states an acidic a TA level on their bottle, you can use that as a reference point.
Well, I think the basic of it is that if you want to sense acetic acid, that's a really simple one to taste because you just buy vinegar.
Right, and you'll know, you can smell it.
And so straight vinegar.
So the great thing with acetic acid is you could just get white vinegar if you want to get away, but you could get anything. But white vinegar is pretty straightforward. You can smell it. Most acids, there's only a handful of volatile acids, and acetic acid or vinegar is one of them. And again, this is coming from our wine experience. Wineries are terrified of volatile acids because they actually have legal limits in which they can use. And so if you go over that legal limit, your wine just became a vinegar, and it went from $19 a bottle to 99 cents a bottle.
Right.
I mean, you just sold the farm. So they're very concerned about that. And coming out of wine industry, we have these people we can talk to come up with a way to measure this and to understand it. Small levels of acetic acid, really low levels actually add palate fullness and brightness to a beer, but you don't really want to smell it. And you don't really want to feel that itchy, kind of scratchy feeling on the back of that. You just want to have a sense of palate fullness or mouthfeel. But yeah, if you go in and just open up a bottle of vinegar, you can smell it. If you took a teaspoon and tasted it, you'll know that it's very identifiable, and as it goes down your palate, it will warm the esophagus.
Now, your best practice might be to measure it out into distilled water in a percentage that might be somewhere close to
yeah,
beer.
You could do that.
Just so that you're sensing it at a level.
And even if you don't know what that is in terms of parts per million, all that, that's not the main thing. If you did just water and then like 1 teaspoon, or if you have some sort of measuring, you could come up with your own way of measuring that, and then what I would do is then go pick a beer that represents that. Go drink a Duchess de Bourgogne, which is like the poster child for a beer that exhibits both lactic and acetic acid, and then the oxidative attribute of that, which is ethyl acetate. Those are all things that happen. Ethyl acetate is that paint thinner and nail polish remover characteristic, which comes from acetic acid later on when it goes further down the line. And Duchess Bourgogne portrays that. And this is no diss on that beer. It's a beer that's been made for 400 years. It's a style, but it tends to exhibit, like in your face, some of these characteristics. And one that might be more subtle would be Rodenbach, a Grand Cru, so if you taste vinegar and then you go try these beers, I think you're going to notice that characteristic. And then as you go off and try beers in your community, you might, if you don't pick it up, then it's not there. I've always said that, when you go to a sour festival, if you really need Tums, it's because you've been probably drinking a lot of acetic acid. not a lot of lactic acid.
Now, another part of this, presentation that you do is tasting lactic acid in varying concentrations.
Yeah.
To try to, convey that same experience, to our own staff and other folks. We've gone out and bought 88% lactic acid solution, which you can buy at, most homebrew shops.
I was going to ask you, where do you get this stuff? I get it from a lab.
No. I mean, any homebrew supply store is generally going to have lactic. I mean, it's something that brewers will routinely use to lower the pH of their mash or whatnot. And so, it's readily available. And if you figure out 88% lactic solution, you can, do the math and figure out how to get certain titratable acidity levels,
right?
With distilled water and create those kinds of blends, and then taste those kinds of blends of that lactic at, those varying acidity levels, and get a sense for what that TA means in pure terms without, some of the other effects of beer itself. Just to understand what that acidity means, in a pure sense. I've done that, for myself, and to also share to others, because you're not always available to give this presentation out to people.
Well, I always tell people when I'm doing this class, and we're going to do it tomorrow for one of our distributors. That'll be interesting. But usually I do it for it's a very geek-centric crowd. People who are really, passionate about it and they're looking for knowledge and education. It's going to be interesting doing this for our distributor, where that may not be the same content, but anyway, what I always tell people, as I said, nowhere is anybody probably ever going to give you water and acid samples, and never should you ever come across this. It's not a natural thing to be drinking water and lactic acid. But I do that just to make it. I do this for my class, so you get a pure sense of what it tastes like. Then we go to beer, where you're bombarded by CO2 and you're bombarded by malt and anything else that's going, and all these other contributions where you have to your brain has to differentiate that. But usually, if it's in a high enough concentration, it's not difficult. So you could, in terms of acetic acid, you can get that at a chain store. I mean, you probably have to go, it's a little more specialized to find lactic acid, but you could certainly find some concentrations there. And then the more important thing there is to get away from those. Those are just to kind of train you. Get into some real beers, not only just like some known brands, but then start trying some breweries in your area and just figure out what level is acceptable to you. I mean, everyone has a different acid level that they appreciate.
Well, and when you say that level that is acceptable to you, I think then we get into the other element of that the experience of beer that people have is not simply based on the level of acid, because that level of acid is also balanced out by any residual body or sweetness or sugar that may be left in that beer. It is also balanced out by other bitterness that might be left in that beer.
I hope so.
And any kind of fruit character that might be in that beer. And simply, from a psychological perspective, that presence of a fruit flavor actually validates, some sense of acidity, because we do associate those things, with each other and our palates, because, most fruit is acidic in that kind of way.
Yeah.
And so all of those things work together in, as you said before, a gestalt kind of way, to produce what we ultimately experience in terms of acidity.
True. And I think there is to me personally, a dividing line. Some people may disagree with me, but I mean, I think we can differentiate. I mean, we have this term that we use for sour beers, and I've never been a fan of that, because we lump in beers that maybe not are sour, like Orval, into that category, because it uses Brettanomyces. And Brettanomyces tends not to produce a lot of acidity. Lactobacillus does, and acetic acid does. But we lump these things in, so we have this assumption that beer should be sour. And I think the beer style that's coming in these days that really truly meets that definition is probably the kettle sour. And a kettle sour truly is I think is a way for breweries that don't have the luxury of having a separate facility to produce lactic acid in their brew house in a way that it limits the risk of contamination. And I mean, because they do it in the kettle and then they boil it, so they basically annihilate any of the bacteria, and they can move forward with that. But what they're really doing is just producing lactic acid. Those beers are very refreshing. They're tart, but they don't have a lot of body or complexity. Those beers that are complex come from that time in barrels, which produces oak component, which also where we get the Brettanomyces component and the lactic acid component. And those beers are definitely produce more complexity and more flavor profile on a broader spectrum. And so we haven't come to this where we've really differentiated that, but I think it's important at some point as we get into this that is an important distinction between beers that are just strictly sour and beers that have some acidity, but they also have Brett, they have wood component and things like that. And having said that, I totally forgot the question you were answering.
There is certainly, pricing differences and, production differences between a beer that spends 48 hours kettle souring
versus
the kettle
48 months
versus
or 12 months or whatever. Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a pricing differential, but there's also a flavor. And not to take anything away from kettle sours, they're very refreshing. They're bright. But they're not. When I drink a kettle sour, I know it's a kettle sour.
Sure.
It's about lactic acid. It truly is. That is the main feature there. When you're drinking a beer that exhibits oak characteristic, Brett characteristic, lactic acid characteristic, it's going to be a bit more broader, and there's more flavor components. I mean, think of Gueuze. Think of a Belgian Gueuze. They really are complex beers, and they take 2 to 4 years to make. And if there was a way to shorten that, I'm sure somebody would figure that out. But in terms of acidity, I think we did this with the hoppy beers, where we went West Coast and we, everyone kind of chest thumped about how their beer went to 11. And we got really bitter. And
1,000 IBUs.
Yeah, whatever. Even though, probably the palate couldn't pick up any more than 70. But that has come back, and now we have a trend with the hazy IPAs that might not even have IBU levels that would meet a pale ale level. So there's this pendulum swing. And I think the same thing is happening with the wild sours is when these first get launched, everyone goes right to the edge. That's that craft beer, what we talked about, that American kind of ingenuity. Let's be creative. Let's see how far we can go with this. And eventually we go too far and we bring it back. And I think what I'm seeing generally is that acid levels are coming down. And I think that's a good thing. If you go to Belgium, or if you get a chance to try Belgian beer, you'll realize the acidity isn't the main point. The acidity is a component of that beer. And the people who drink these beers don't drink 2 ounces at a bottle share. They drink 10 ounces or whatever it is in metric, or whatever, because they're drinking it with food. It's not as something to test and put on WhatsApp. It's something they consume as part of their daily routine. Eating, drinking, and what have you.
That's a really good point. And it was a beautiful experience sitting at Grotdorst in Einsringen and watching old Belgians just drink Gueuze because that's just what they enjoyed to drink on a Sunday afternoon.
Do you realize Jamie has a pretty tough life here?
I do it for science, Jeffers.
It's work.
But but having said that, I think what you said is right, that there are some interesting differences in American approaches to sour beer. And in particular, what I've found, and that this is an opinion that's conditioned by talking to sour beer makers, there is a West Coast approach to sour beer that is very much, similar, as you say, to that West Coast approach to IBU. That if we're going to make sour beer, it has to be the most sour,
Yeah,
the most
I mean,
assaulting, the
full
most
throttle.
intense, and it has to be about being able to endure the most acid component in your beer possible. And even from a maker perspective, I've talked to a number of brewers who are like, I wish I could make more subtle and balanced sour beer, and yet what my audience, those people that buy my beer, want to drink is more intensely acidic, because they feel that is that is somehow a measure of who they are as beer drinkers. And so for you, as somebody that makes and sells that kind of sour beer, how do you balance what that audience expects and the art of building that balance into your beer itself?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I mean, ultimately, we have to be happy with, we have to. There's the one half, which is we want to make what we want to make, as artists, as beer makers, and then there on the other side of that is we're not philanthropic. We are selling beer, so we have to make sure that we're making beer that people will purchase. So there's those sometimes those things, it's a sort of a constant battle towards equilibrium on that one. And lately, what we realize is I think we've gone through the make it more sour phase. A lot of breweries that I'm familiar with are toning down their bitterness. I mean, their acidity. And I was at a brewery today where we talked about a similar issue. Is when your lactic acid in your environment becomes more comfortable, whether your barrels, it starts to just produce a lot of lactic acid. So your acid levels start to go up. And if you don't want your beer to go up, you have to figure out how to blend that out. It's just one of those things. It's just one of these things, these challenges that we work with these wild yeast and bacteria. But ultimately, we like, our philosophy towards that is we make what we like to make, but we're not so out of it that we're not going to make something that we don't think people are going to enjoy. One of the things that we've had to adapt to is our audience wants more beers that are fermented with fruit. We personally tend to like the more rustic beers, the more gueuze, like the lambic style beers. That's at the end of the day, that's what we want to drink. But we recognize that people like beers that are fermented with fruit, so we produce a lot of beers that are fermented with fruit. And it's not that we don't like them; we love them. It's just that our preference is more towards these more rustic, straight up beers because for us, we get to pick up what the barrel's doing. We pick up what the wild yeast is doing. When you add fruit, it's another dimension. It's one more thing that you kind of have to work with. But it's also one more exciting thing to add an element to your beer. So, it's an evolving process. It's not static. What we made 4 years ago and sold in 2 seconds is not what we're making today. Those beers are people are like, oh, I've had that before. And so we will continuously evolve, and one of the things that we do is, which makes it interesting for us, is instead of making the same beer month in, month out, which we've never done at Barrelworks, we make it usually once a year and then we come back and make it the next year, is we're not doing that anymore, is we're making new beers. And so typically we're making new beers with where we're fermenting fruit or doing something that's just unusual. And that's how we do something that keeps our creative juices going, but also is satisfying our clientele in terms of what they're looking for.
So for these beers that take 2 years to come to fruition, how do you guess 2 years in the future at to what people are going to want?
Roll the dice, man. It's it's usually a year. I mean, it's you pointed out one of our issues. It's sort of the issues that I remember taking an economics class when I was in college, and they used a reference to a static supply curve and a dynamic demand curve was coffee and whiskey. mainly Scotch whiskey, is that it takes years to make those products. Whether you're growing the tree or you're producing the whiskey, you have no idea what demand's going to be in 5 years. You just have to go for it. And while we don't have that long of a period, ours is 1 year to 2 year. It's still a little difficult in that we have to have an idea of what. And again, we don't put our finger in the air going, what do people want? We kind of look at what interests us in what we're doing, and then we say, well, is this really out there, or is this something we think people, in terms of trends and all that, are people are comfortable with? It's a secondary condition, but it's still a condition. But ultimately, it's really 2 to 3 people sitting in a room saying, you know what, I've really wanted to work with, I've literally had a conversation where it's like, I really want to ferment a beer in the hollow of a tree trunk. And it's like, well, that's an interesting idea. Can we make enough to sell to, can we produce, 2,000 cases of that? No. Okay, let's move on. No, actually, it's not move on. Let's do that on a small level and see how it goes. But we have those, we have those kind of esoteric conversations, but ultimately, can we produce enough to satisfy our clientele? And we're not huge. We Barrelworks will probably produce somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 barrels this year. That's small.
It's especially small considering that Firestone Walker is over 300,000 barrels of total production right now?
I'd say over 400,000.
Over 400,000.
Which still, from a
so you are 1/400th of
yes,
Firestone
we are,
Walker's
and I'm
production.
reminded of that every time because my job is to scream and yell and advocate for Barrelworks, and I'm always told in an English accent, Jeff, just remind you that you're only 1% of production. Barrelworks keeps us in touch with our roots, where we came from, our barrels, because we started brewing beer in barrels when we were making 800 barrels a year. It keeps us in touch with tradition, and it keeps us in touch with our creative style. So it's small. I always refer to it as the mouse that roars. Barrelworks is the mouse that roars. It's an important function of Firestone Walker. It's a very important story to tell. Even though it's small in terms of volume, it's huge in terms of who we are. I sometimes have to remind our marketing people of that.
Well, Jeffers, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
A pleasure.
I appreciate your perspective on this. Keep making the beers that you and Jim have crazy ideas to make because they're delicious and I enjoy them all.
So next up is the hummus and pita chip beer. I'm joking, but
what's your wife going to say about that?
It depends on what I put in it.
Just
right?
don't call it hummus.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Touche.
Well, thank you for joining me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. Can't wait to see you at the Firestone Walker Invitational Beer Festival next year.
Hopefully, we'll see you before that. But yes,
probably the Great American Beer Festival before that. Maybe another occasion. We'll find out.
Awesome.
If you've enjoyed listening to this episode of the podcast, I really hope you'd subscribe on whatever podcast platform you listen to. And if you enjoy this and other stories, then please subscribe to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, where you can learn more about all of the fantastic beer that Jeffers and all the other folks at Firestone Walker make specifically for you. Until next time, we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
This episode has been brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, the country's only not-for-profit membership organization dedicated to promoting the community of homebrewers and empowering homebrewers to make the best beer in the world. Brew with the AHA at homebrewersassociation.org, and remember, relax, don't worry, have a homebrew. This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.